So I'm here in Indianapolis for the 2022 Informs annual meeting, our first officially fully in-person meeting since before the pandemic in 2019. We're recording a live podcast, quote-unquote live version of the Informs Resoundingly Human podcast. I'm joined by Brian Macdonald, who has just finished doing his keynote address, Sports Analytics, and he's joining me to talk a little bit about sports analytics. So Brian, thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So I have to know, what came first for you, an interest in sports or in analytics? I think I already know the answer, but let's get it officially.
Well, probably I would have to answer that by saying sports came first, mostly because analytics wasn't a word that I even knew when I was a kid. So I don't even know if it was a word that sort of existed in common language back then. So for sure, growing up, I liked sports a lot, played a lot of baseball and basketball, a little bit later on hockey. I always liked math, actually. So that was very early on. I liked mathematics. But yeah, didn't really start doing analytics or even know what it was probably until graduate school.
Okay, interesting. That was kind of what I suspected, that the sports came first. Could you share a bit more about your background? I know you're currently with Yale. You actually spent some time working for ESPN previously. Could you kind of walk us through your professional journey?
Sure. So I went to undergraduate at Lafayette College and was an electrical engineering major. Started at Johns Hopkins as electrical engineering, and after a semester switched to math. So I ended up doing my PhD in math there. Sort of right after I defended my PhD thesis, I started working on sports analytics, basically. My first job out of school was at West Point as an assistant professor, and that was a good place to start learning about sports analytics and statistics and so forth, because it was a very applied department. And so I started doing sports analytics research there. Eventually started talking with teams. Eventually, through a friend of a friend of a friend, got in touch with the Florida Panthers, and eventually went down to work for the Florida Panthers full-time as director of hockey analytics.
Oh, wow.
And then after 4 years there, I spent a year at University of Miami, and then I moved up to Connecticut and was with ESPN, and then I spent some time at Carnegie Mellon, and now I'm at Yale. So kind of did sort of floated back and forth between academia and industry a little bit. Certainly like pros and cons of both. Happy to be back in academia though, and I think I'll probably stay for a while.
That's interesting. We actually did another podcast here. We looked at, I actually had two guests, and we looked at sort of the different paths that they took, one in industry and one in academia, sort of geared towards a lot of the attendees here who are going to be making that choice or are in the middle of making that choice. So that's interesting that you sort of have gone back and forth to both. That's really interesting. So to sort of set the stage, could you give a brief history of how analytics was sort of first introduced to sports, or like the meet cute for sports and analytics?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been some analytics, or at least statistical analysis of sports, maybe not called analytics, being done for decades, even back when there wasn't as good of data as there is now. Even just with just basic game summary data, you can do things like come up with team ratings. This is the first thing I talked about in my talk, actually, was just with basic game information, final score, the teams, the date, where it was played, who was home team, and so forth. You can use a simple regression model to come up with team ratings. So it's been going on for a while. I think like one of the key moments was actually the book Moneyball, and then the movie Moneyball, which even more people saw. I think that really, I mean, it was really building in baseball before then. Maybe not so much in other sports, but it was becoming a lot more popular in baseball. And then I think there was kind of like a sort of maybe a tipping point or a trigger that it just set off analytics to be widely used in sports. And then I hear people from other industries, like basically not so much recently, but back then, basically say, well, we want to do Moneyball, but for fill in the blank of my industry. So it was really something that I think helped move sports analytics forward in sports, but also analytics forward in other fields which maybe were not considered like traditional fields where data was analyzed.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess it was, data was being used in finance and in medicine and things like that. But yeah, I think Moneyball helped people realize that it could be applied to like anything, even things that you wouldn't think of.
It's interesting. I didn't know that. So how has the role of analytics in sports sort of continued to develop since then?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it has to do with, I guess, a couple things. Just as an analyst, there's a couple things that you have to do. You have to analyze data, and then you have to communicate what you find with others. So I think the role has changed in the sense that data has changed. There's a lot more data available now. There's player tracking data where you have the locations of the players and the ball several times a second throughout the entire game. And that takes a different set of sort of analysis tools and statistical techniques.
Okay.
I also think it's changed because the communication aspect has changed also, just as analytics becomes more accepted. There's certain things when you're communicating what you're doing to someone in the organization. Maybe 10 years ago, maybe you had to spend more time, trying to convince them that using data is going to help help them make decisions. Maybe in a lot of organizations, that's no longer something that they have to spend time on. It's more specifically about. It's more specific to the project that they're working on, so they can get into more details. And so, I would think. I mean, it's hard to know what's going on inside organizations, but I would think the communication is hopefully, as time goes on, more sort of bi-directional communication. In an ideal situation, the analyst gets ideas from just hearing what the coaches are talking about. The coaches have ideas that they come to the analysts with and say, hey, can you take a look at this? So I think that aspect of things has gotten a lot better, and what the analyst has to focus on is just changed a little bit.
So is there any area of sports analytics that you think is or feel is sort of untapped? I guess the next great application.
Yeah, I mean, I still think like the player tracking data it's not untapped, but I think there's still a lot that can be done with that hasn't been done yet. And it's somewhat new in some sports, even like hockey, just within the past couple of years, got player tracking data. It's been around for a while in basketball, but the quality is improving, and just the data that's available just keeps improving. So so I think the player tracking data, and then eventually in baseball there's now pose data, which is basically the locations of limbs of the players, not just kind of like where like the sort of the center of mass of the player is, or just generally where the player is standing. You have where all the limbs are, so where the pitcher is releasing the ball and things like that. And that'll be useful in other sports too, if that data becomes available. In basketball, where a defender has his hand when he's how close is the hand when he's guarding a player and things like that. So that's something that's untapped, mostly because it's not available yet in most places. There's probably a lot to be done with biomedical data, and some stuff's being done internally in teams, but that might be another area where teams can gain an advantage by working with data.
Okay, that's interesting. I think this was obvious from how you came to be in sports analytics. Sports came first. Do you think there's a way to use that people are interested in sports as a hobby, and also potentially professionally, to kind of entice and inform sort of the next generation in this field?
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of people in academia who use sports in their classes to get students interested in statistics and data science, operations research, economics, business, computer science. In fact, I'm part of a group of professors at, see if I get this right, Baylor, Carnegie Mellon, Pitt, St. Lawrence, West Point, and Yale. We got together and wrote an NSF grant. where the topic was exactly using sports analytics to get students interested in data science. And so, yeah, this is definitely something that can be, it's definitely useful to use sports to get students interested in data science. It's something that's pretty popular, pretty widely popular. It's a situation where the students kind of have some sort of subject matter expertise before they start working on it, because they've played sports or they watch sports or whatever. So, yeah.
It's always nice to love what you do. So,
Yeah.
so I feel like sports analytics, it's not necessarily a buzzword, but it's becoming a term that most people have an understanding of, or at least think they have an understanding of. Is there something that you wish maybe the average person, when I say the average person, someone without an analytics background, knew about sports analytics?
I think one of the things that, this is probably true for all data analytics, but just it takes a long time to create models, or even just to work with raw data and clean the data and sort of organize it before you even start building a model. Just there's a lot of time that needs to be spent on that, and but it is worth it in the end, because eventually it can sort of be automated or semi-automated, and you don't have to worry about it so much anymore. But there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that you can't see necessarily on the TV. You see the final results on the TV, but there's a lot of data engineers and so forth, and working behind the scenes, just working on the data to get the data good. The data is the foundation, and you just got to spend a lot of time on the foundation. So,
Brian, thank you so much for joining me. This was super fun and informative, especially for your non-sports savvy host. So thank you so much.
All right, thank you for having me.